There are moments in history that break the spine of civilization, not with war or bloodshed, but with an idea so terrifying, so destabilizing that its echo reshapes the human soul. Friedrich Nietzsche, standing at the edge of the 19th century, cast one such echo into the abyss. He didn't shout it from pulpits or battlefields. He whispered it through the cracked lens of philosophy. God is dead. At first glance, it sounds like a defiant slogan, a war cry of atheism, maybe even a celebration of progress. But Nietzsche wasn't celebrating. He was mourning. He wasn't warning the world about a God that had been killed. He was revealing a truth most already knew, but few dared to face, that in the wake of science, rationalism, and the Enlightenment, the foundations of faith, once the bedrock of Western identity, were quietly collapsing. But what does it mean for God to be dead? And why does it matter, especially today? It matters because for thousands of years, God was more than an idea. He was the axis upon which meaning, morality, and purpose revolved. In His image, humans found order. In His judgment, justice. In His silence, awe. When Nietzsche declared his death, he wasn't proclaiming victory. He was diagnosing a civilization drifting, unanchored in a void. A world without God isn't necessarily one without churches or rituals. It's a world where values become unmoored, truth becomes negotiable, and the self must construct meaning out of chaos. This is where the modern individual stands, on a crumbling cliff where certainty used to be, suspended in a reality where God no longer explains suffering, no longer redeems struggle, no longer guarantees a higher order. And so, in His absence, suffering begins to mutate. It's no longer sanctified. It becomes absurd. And what's more, it becomes chronic, infecting not just individual psyches, but entire systems, institutions, and cultures. The script is not about theology. It's about what happens when the guiding story of civilization vanishes, and we're left to make sense of pain, power, and purpose on our own. We begin not with the void itself, but with how we got here, how the divine throne was emptied, how certainty was dismantled, and how, in the wreckage, we began to suffer in a new and unfamiliar way. Welcome to a world after the death of God. For most of human history, God wasn't an idea you debated. He was the foundation of reality itself. In ancient times, the divine was not confined to temples or scriptures. It permeated every aspect of life. Sunlight was the face of a god, thunder the voice of a deity. To question the divine was not merely heresy, it was madness, a betrayal of the only order people knew. Religious authority was not a component of society, it was society. The pharaohs of Egypt were living gods. The kings of Mesopotamia ruled by divine mandate. In medieval Europe, monarchs ruled de gratia, by the grace of God. The church didn't just influence culture, it was culture. It dictated morality, defined laws, controlled knowledge, and shaped every aspect of identity for 1,000 years. In the West, the church held the pen that wrote human purpose. Life was suffering, yes, but suffering was sacred. Trials were not meaningless, they were tests, punishments, or paths to redemption. Death wasn't the end, it was the threshold to eternity. In this worldview, pain had context, morality had certainty, and reality had order. But power, once held too tightly for too long, begins to crack. The Renaissance whispered rebellion. The Reformation shouted it. Martin Luther nailed his grievances to the cathedral door, and the sacred monopoly began to fracture. The printing press poured fuel on the fire, giving birth to a new kind of scripture. Secular knowledge, science, stepped forward not as an enemy of truth, but as its new interpreter. Galileo peered through a telescope and saw a cosmos without divine architecture. Darwin studied fossils and found no Eden. And thinkers like Descartes, Hume, and Kant began to ask, what if truth is not revealed from above, but discovered from within? Slowly, the divine narrative began to lose its grip. Religion didn't vanish overnight, but its absolute authority began to erode. The Enlightenment, for all its progress, left a chasm. Rationalism challenged dogma, but didn't replace meaning. Science explained the how of life, but stumbled on the why. As the sacred lost its authority, so did the structures it upheld. Morality became subjective, identity became fluid, truth became relative. Without a divine anchor, society drifted into a new era, one of freedom, yes, but also fragmentation. And yet, something strange happened. The more we liberated ourselves from religious control, the more we began to replicate it in other forms. Political ideologies emerged that demanded loyalty like theocracies once did. Nationalism replaced sainthood with citizenship. Economic systems took on moral dimensions, capitalism promising salvation through success, communism offering redemption through revolution. These weren't just political theories, they became belief systems. They gave people a cause, a structure, a sense of meaning. And still, the ache remained, because while we dethroned God, we didn't eliminate the need for something greater. We didn't lose our desire for meaning, we lost the map that pointed to it. Modern skepticism may have exposed the cracks in religion, but it also left many stranded in existential silence. The promise of individual autonomy came at a price: disconnection, alienation, and uncertainty. We became our own gods, and with that came unbearable responsibility. Today, religious belief persists, but its authority no longer defines the fabric of reality. In many places, the sacred is now private, optional, customized. Morality is crowdsourced. Spirituality is fragmented, and truth is increasingly whatever gains the most traction. This is the fall not of religion itself, but of its unifying power. Nietzsche didn't celebrate this fall. He saw what was coming. He foresaw a future where humanity, unmoored from absolute values, would face a deeper kind of suffering, not physical, but existential. Not because there was no longer a God to fear, but because there was no longer a story to belong to. And when the sacred story dissolves, what replaces it? That question would haunt the 20th century, fuel ideological revolutions, and create a new form of suffering, one rooted not in faith, but in its absence. We now live in the aftermath. The throne remains empty, but the need for meaning still burns. And so, we search not always in temples, but in ideologies, in screens, in algorithms, in self-help mantras and endless consumption. We worship still, but differently. And in that shift from obedience to autonomy, from sacred to secular, a strange kind of pain was born, one that is harder to name, and even harder to cure. This is the beginning of that pain, not in fire and brimstone, but in silence, in the absence of divine answers, in the vacuum left behind. And it is in that silence where the next phase of our suffering begins, inside the mind. When the great religious narratives began to crumble, they left behind more than empty cathedrals and abandoned rituals. They left behind an absence, a hollow space where certainty used to live. For the human mind, this was not liberation. It was a slow, creeping disaster. Nietzsche understood something that most of his contemporaries missed. Belief is not optional for the psyche. It is not a luxury. It is a necessity. Like food or shelter, meaning is something the mind requires to survive. Remove it, and the consequences are not immediate. They are insidious. They rot us from the inside out. Without an overarching narrative to explain suffering, the mind begins to collapse in on itself. Existentialism emerged in the 20th century not as an academic exercise, but as a psychological emergency. Thinkers like Jean-Paul Sartre, Albert Camus, and Viktor Frankl grappled with a terrifying new reality, a world that is indifferent, chaotic, and ungoverned by higher laws. In such a world, human beings are forced to confront an unbearable freedom, a freedom that demands we invent meaning for ourselves, knowing all the while that meaning is, at bottom, a human fabrication. Sartre called this the condemnation of freedom. We are condemned to be free, he said, because without a God to assign purpose, the full weight of existence falls on our own shoulders. There are no cosmic instructions, no divine blueprint, only choice, and every choice carries the burden of responsibility. But most human minds are not built to bear that much weight. Psychologist Viktor Frankl, himself a survivor of Auschwitz, argued that meaning is not just a philosophical curiosity, it is a survival mechanism. In the darkest conditions imaginable, those who found even a shred of meaning, whether in love, in memory, or in future purpose, were the ones who endured. Those who lost all meaning disintegrated, often physically as well as psychologically. Meaninglessness is not neutral, it is corrosive, It erodes motivation, hollows out relationships, and feeds despair. In the absence of a higher order, many turn inward, searching for purpose in self-actualization, success, or pleasure. But these substitutes often fail to satisfy. Pleasure without purpose becomes empty hedonism. Success without meaning breeds vanity and chronic dissatisfaction. Even the pursuit of self-actualization without a transcendent anchor risks collapsing into narcissism. The psychologist Erich Fromm warned of this in his work Escape from Freedom. He argued that as people became freer from external authorities, they increasingly fled into conformity, authoritarianism, or mindless distraction. Freedom, stripped of meaning, becomes intolerable. And so, we anesthetize ourselves through consumerism, entertainment, or ideological possession. The modern mind is saturated with choice. Never before in human history have individuals had so much freedom to define themselves. Yet paradoxically, depression, anxiety, and despair are epidemic. The suicide rate, particularly in wealthier, more secular societies, quietly rises year after year. Mental health crises are no longer aberrations, they are becoming the norm. Why? Because choice without meaning is a form of torture. It is the agony of infinite paths, none of which seem to lead home. The loss of religious belief did not eliminate humanity's hunger for answers, it merely starved it. And in starvation, the mind becomes desperate. It clings to new gods, celebrity, status, political ideology, even the self itself, none of which can bear the weight of existential need. Social media amplifies this starvation. In the digital world, identity is curated like a brand. Worth is measured in likes, followers, and fleeting attention. The self becomes a performance, hollow and restless, addicted to validation, yet incapable of finding genuine fulfillment. Here, meaning is externalized, monetized, and ultimately betrayed. Meanwhile, the deeper questions, who am I? Why am I here? What is worth suffering for? Are buried under layers of distraction. In a sense, Nietzsche foresaw the spiritual dimension of the modern psychological crisis. When he proclaimed the death of God, he also warned that in his absence, humans would either create new, destructive idols or succumb to nihilism. The belief that life is utterly meaningless. He feared, above all, the passive nihilist, the person who, having realized the emptiness of existence, resigns themselves to apathy, addiction, or despair, not with a bang, but with a whimper, a slow, anesthetized surrender to meaninglessness. And yet, Nietzsche did not advocate retreat. He challenged humanity to rise, to become the creators of new values, to forge meaning through strength, art, courage, and self-overcoming. This, he believed, was the destiny of the Übermensch, the Overman, an individual who embraces the chaos of existence and molds it into a new kind of order. But for most, that task remains overwhelming. It is easier to escape, to numb, to conform. Thus, the psychological fallout of God's death continues to unfold, not only in philosophy classrooms and academic journals, but in ordinary lives through quiet despair, hidden addictions, and a pervasive sense of alienation that no amount of technology or material wealth can seem to fix. We are still creatures searching for meaning in a cosmos that no longer guarantees it. And the question that Nietzsche left hanging, the question that echoes still, is simple and terrible. Now that the old gods are dead, what will you do with your freedom? Because in that freedom lies either redemption or ruin. And increasingly, in our desperate hunger for belonging, new idols begin to emerge, not carved in stone or gold, but forged in ideologies, in collective movements, and in the machinery of mass persuasion. Where faith once reigned, new masters now rise, and the consequences are only beginning to unfold. When the divine narrative fades, something else inevitably fills the void. For much of history, religious faith was the supreme, guiding principle of life. But once the authority of the church waned, once God's voice was drowned out by reason and skepticism, humanity's hunger for meaning did not disappear. It simply transformed. In the 20th century, we saw the rise of ideological movements that sought to fill the sacred space religion once occupied. Political ideologies, in particular, emerged not just as systems of governance, but as comprehensive belief systems offering identity, purpose, and meaning to millions of people. From Marxism to fascism, from nationalism to liberalism, these ideologies provided answers to life's big questions, promising salvation, redemption, and societal order in the absence of religious certainty. At first glance, the rise of secular ideologies might seem like progress and evolution beyond ancient superstitions, a leap into a world of reason and enlightenment. But beneath this facade, there is something deeply insidious. Ideologies, by their very nature, demand adherence. They do not simply propose ideas, they demand allegiance, loyalty, and, ultimately, sacrifice. They promise a version of truth, so absolute, so certain, that anything outside it becomes not just wrong, but dangerous. And in that demand for absolute certainty, ideologies quickly cross the line from reasoned argument to fanaticism, where religion once offered a moral framework that individuals could interpret with some flexibility. Ideologies began to provide a much stricter moral code. The lines between good and evil were drawn in sharper contrast. There was no longer room for nuance, for questioning, for doubt. Every deviation from the ideology became an act of betrayal, an affront to the purity of the cause. The psychological power of ideology lies in its ability to create a sense of belonging. It offers something that the loss of religious faith cannot: a ready-made community with shared values, a sense of purpose that transcends the mundane struggles of daily life. In a world where existential uncertainty reigns, where individuals feel unmoored and insignificant, ideologies present themselves as a lifeline, a way to find order, identity, and direction. Take, for instance, the rise of communism in the early 20th century. For millions of disenfranchised people, it wasn't just a political theory. It was a vision of salvation. Marx's promise of a classless society, a utopia where all people would be free from the tyranny of capital, became not just an economic model, but a movement with near religious fervor. Believers were ready to sacrifice everything: family, fortune, even life itself, for the promise of a future that would never arrive. In this, we see the essential danger of ideology. It thrives by providing a mythic vision of the future, one that justifies all manner of violence, oppression, and manipulation in the present. Similarly, nationalism took the place of religion. In the hearts of millions during the early 20th century, leaders like Mussolini and Hitler didn't just appeal to the pride of their nations, they invoked the language of destiny, of a higher mission. Nationalism became a kind of collective faith, one in which the state was worshipped and dissent was viewed not as disagreement, but as treason. It is no surprise, then, that nationalist movements often lean toward authoritarianism, as the ideology needs control to maintain its narrative. But the appeal of ideologies is not confined to totalitarian regimes. Even in democratic societies, ideologies are rampant. The rise of identity politics, for example, has created an environment where individual identity is tied to a set of political or social beliefs. These beliefs, once flexible and open to discussion, are now treated with the same fervor as religious dogma. The individual who strays from the party line is ostracized, accused of betrayal or complicity with oppression. Psychologically, this shift is a double-edged sword. On one hand, ideology provides certainty in an uncertain world. It answers questions like, what is my purpose? What is my place in the world? It offers clarity in the face of chaos. But on the other hand, it demands conformity, punishes dissent, and leaves little room for genuine personal reflection. When identity becomes so tightly bound to an ideology, the self becomes less about individual experience and more about allegiance to a larger cause. The individual, in essence, is consumed by the ideology. The dangers of ideological extremism are legion. Extremism occurs when ideology turns inward, when it consumes the very people who once espoused it. Take, for example, the rise of radical political movements in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. In these movements, the ideology is no longer just a set of ideas, it becomes the ultimate truth, and anyone who challenges it is an enemy to be eradicated. The logic of extremism turns people into soldiers of their cause, willing to use violence and coercion to defend the ideological purity they believe in. But the true psychological danger lies not just in the extremism itself, but in the emptiness. Ideology fills the void left by religion's collapse, but it cannot truly replace what was lost. It offers no lasting satisfaction, no real sense of spiritual peace. What it provides instead is a constant, gnawing tension, the tension between the demands of the ideology and the human need for personal meaning, for complexity, for nuance. As the individual drowns in ideological certainty, they are left with a fractured, dehumanized sense of self. This is the paradox of modernity. As religion recedes, humanity seeks new forms of salvation. But in this search, we often fall prey to the same mechanisms of control, the same psychological traps that religion once imposed. In the end, the real danger of ideology is not just its extremism or its manipulation of the masses. It is its ability to hollow out the human soul, to turn the complex, unique individual into a mere cog in a much larger machine, a machine that promises salvation, but delivers only submission. Ideologies may offer purpose, but they do so at a price. That price is the loss of the self, the surrender of the individual to something larger, something more powerful, something that, in the end, may prove just as hollow as the empty church pews that once defined our world. So, as we navigate the post-religious world, we must ask ourselves, what are we willing to surrender in the search for meaning? And in our pursuit of new faiths, new ideologies, will we end up trapped in a new kind of prison, a prison that promises freedom, but delivers only another form of control? In a world where God once defined truth, where religious narratives painted the structure of reality, we now turn to a new authority, the media. The shift is not just one of content, it is a shift of power. No longer do we look to divine revelation or sacred texts to shape our understanding of the world. Now, we look to our screens, the media, in its various forms, news outlets, social media platforms, entertainment industries has become the modern-day storyteller. The narrative it weaves is not always overtly ideological. It's subtler, more insidious. It's embedded in the very structure of what we see and hear. This manufactured reality shapes our perceptions, governs our beliefs, and most powerfully, influences how we feel. In this post-religious world, where meaning is often a construct of individual will, media has stepped in to fill the void. What's more, it does so in a way that is deeply manipulative, often without the viewer even realizing it. The average person spends hours a day consuming media, be it through the news, social platforms, advertisements, or entertainment. What happens when a society is constantly fed a narrative that it does not question, but merely absorbs? To understand the psychological power of media manipulation, we need to examine the mechanisms behind it. Propaganda is the deliberate attempt to shape perception and control behavior. Unlike simple information, propaganda is designed to steer people toward a desired outcome, to influence their thoughts, opinions, and actions. It's a tool of power, a way of controlling the masses without them ever feeling coerced. This is where media wields its power most effectively. The early 20th century saw the rise of state-controlled propaganda, from Hitler's use of radio to Stalin's manipulation of Soviet cinema. But in today's world, we see a more insidious form of propaganda, the kind that is personalized, invisible, and algorithm-driven. Social media platforms like Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube have become massive engines of mass influence, tailoring content to individual preferences, pushing narratives that align with the viewer's existing biases. The result is a highly polarized society where confirmation bias reigns supreme. People aren't consuming information that challenges them, but rather information that reaffirms their beliefs. The psychological mechanisms behind this are both simple and profound. The human mind is inherently social, wired to conform, to belong. We're hardwired to seek out others who think like us, who share our values, and who reaffirm our sense of identity. Social media platforms exploit this need for belonging by creating echo chambers, environments where opposing views are silenced and groupthink flourishes. We don't just follow people on social media, we surround ourselves with ideologies that flatter our existing worldview, and we reject anything that threatens it. This process isn't just about information, it's about emotion. Media knows how to manipulate the deepest parts of the human psyche: the desire for belonging, the fear of being left out, the craving for certainty. By exploiting these emotions, media can manufacture a reality that doesn't just reflect the world, it shapes the world. Consider the role of news outlets. We don't just watch the news for facts, we watch to know how to feel about those facts. Media outlets are quick to tap into the collective emotional pulse, presenting events in ways that trigger outrage, fear, or even joy, emotions that are far more likely to be shared, spread, and acted upon. But this emotional manipulation goes further than just generating clicks. It serves a larger function: control. Propaganda operates not through overt persuasion, but through the creation of an environment in which individuals come to accept certain narratives as true, not because they've been convinced logically, but because they've been emotionally conditioned to do so. The emotional trigger is the gateway to action, be it purchasing a product, voting for a politician, or supporting a particular social movement. Consider also the rise of misinformation. In a world where everyone can be a content creator, facts become slippery, and the lines between truth and fiction blur. In 2020, the world witnessed a surge in conspiracy theories, fueled by both digital platforms and traditional media outlets. While some of these were harmless, many tapped into deeper societal fears of losing control, of being manipulated, of facing an uncertain future. Misinformation, especially when emotionally charged, spreads rapidly because it plays on our most primal fears. It creates enemies, it divides, it incites action based on false or incomplete information. This phenomenon can be explained through the concept of cognitive dissonance, the discomfort we feel when our beliefs are challenged by new, contradictory information. Instead of adjusting our views, we often double down on our existing beliefs, sometimes even more fiercely, in order to resolve the discomfort. Media outlets know this and exploit it, feeding us information that aligns with our existing biases, making it harder to distinguish fact from fiction. The most insidious aspect of modern media manipulation, however, is how it commodifies truth itself. In the old world, truth was handed down by gods, kings, or philosophers. Now, it is determined by algorithms, by companies driven by profit, and by influencers who shape culture for personal gain. The concept of truth becomes flexible, negotiable, and ultimately subjective. What was once objective fact is now up for debate, manipulated by those with the power to shape perception. In this new landscape, reality becomes a product, one that is bought and sold, packaged to cater to our desires, fears, and beliefs. And in the process, we lose touch with something essential: the ability to discern the truth for ourselves. In the end, the psychological power of media lies not in what it tells us, but in how it makes us feel. It doesn't just present the world, it shapes it. It doesn't just inform, it creates entire worlds of meaning, built from fragments of truth, emotion, and narrative. And as we navigate this new reality, we must ask, in the digital age, where information is limitless but truth is elusive, what is the cost of losing our ability to see the world as it truly is? Nietzsche's proclamation that God is dead was not merely a comment on the decline of religious belief. It was a radical diagnosis of a profound existential crisis facing humanity, a crisis that continues to echo through the corridors of modern society. Long after Nietzsche's death, the question he posed, what happens when the sacred is no longer our guiding principle, remains as urgent and relevant today as it was in the late 19th century. To understand Nietzsche's enduring relevance, we must look at the ways in which his critique of religion and its consequences manifest in contemporary issues. His work was not simply a philosophical critique, it was a warning. The death of God, he argued, would not lead to a utopia of reason and enlightenment, but to a vacuum, a cultural and psychological void that would unleash a host of destructive forces. Today, this void is felt in various crises, from the rise of ideologies and the fragmentation of truth to the erosion of meaning in everyday life. First, let's examine the spiritual crisis that Nietzsche foresaw, which is more palpable now than ever. As religion continues to decline in many parts of the world, particularly in Western societies. People are increasingly left to navigate a world devoid of ultimate purpose. Nietzsche understood that without a divine anchor, individuals would be forced to create their own values. This existential freedom, however, came with a heavy burden. In the absence of God, human beings must grapple with the chaos of existence without a universal moral framework to guide. This is where modern nihilism, as Nietzsche predicted, takes root. In a society increasingly fragmented by consumerism, political polarization, and technological advancement, many people are left feeling adrift. The pursuit of material wealth, success, and personal pleasure often leaves a deep sense of emptiness in its wake. We've replaced religious faith with fleeting satisfactions, which, in turn, feed feelings of alienation and purposelessness. It's no coincidence that mental health crises, such as depression and anxiety, are at an all-time high in societies where the spiritual has been increasingly marginalized. Nietzsche's ideas also resonate powerfully in the context of modern, political and ideological movements, where once religion filled the role of providing meaning and community. Today, we turn to ideologies to give us a sense of belonging and purpose. The void left by the death of God has been filled with political ideologies, whether on the left, the right, or in the form of nationalism and populism. These ideologies often become the new religion, offering a totalizing worldview that demands absolute allegiance, suppressing nuance and creating a binary vision of good versus evil. This shift to ideological absolutism has led to the rise of what some call culture wars, intense political conflicts where identity, morality, and truth are no longer up for debate, but are seen as existential stakes. Nietzsche's critique of the herd mentality is more relevant than ever. In a world where collective ideologies dominate, individual autonomy and critical thinking are often sacrificed on the altar of ideological purity. Like the zealots of religious crusades, modern political extremists are willing to do anything rhetorically, and at times literally, to defend their ideological truth. But the ideological battles of today are not simply about politics. They also reflect the tension between individuality and the collective. Nietzsche's concept of the Übermensch, the Overman, was an individual who could transcend the constraints of conventional morality and create his own values. Yet, in a society dominated by the narratives of political correctness, social justice movements, or the pressures of identity politics, the individual is often subsumed by the group. The idea of radical self-overcoming is drowned out by the louder demands of ideological conformity. In addition to the rise of ideologies, the internet and social media have created a new kind of collective reality, a digital space where truth, identity, and meaning are constantly contested and reshaped. The internet has become a new arena where people are bombarded with competing narratives, often sensationalized or distorted, that play on their emotions and biases. Nietzsche's warning that modern man would become the slave of a herd of followers is realized today in the world of online echo chambers, where people retreat into ideological silos, constantly reinforced by algorithmically curated content. This fosters a kind of digital tribalism, where one's identity is increasingly defined by the group or the cause one supports. At the same time, the quest for self-actualization and personal fulfillment, which Nietzsche so passionately advocated for, has been commodified in the age of consumerism. Personal development and self-help have become industries in which the promise of meaning and empowerment is sold to us in glossy books, podcasts, and courses. Nietzsche, in many ways, foresaw the rise of this kind of shallow, commodified self-creation, in which true self-overcoming is reduced to a marketing strategy. In a world driven by consumerism and instant gratification, the deep, existential work that Nietzsche advocated for, facing the abyss of life, creating new values, embracing the struggle of existence, has been repackaged as something easy and marketable. The idea of self-overcoming, at its core, is about confronting suffering and embracing chaos in order to create something meaningful. Yet today, it is often presented as an effortless path to success and happiness. Perhaps the most chilling legacy of Nietzsche's work is his prescient understanding of the potential dangers of power vacuums. Without a central moral authority, People are left to navigate a world increasingly shaped by external forces, be it political leaders, corporate giants, or media moguls. The struggle for power in a world without God is a struggle for meaning itself, and as Nietzsche predicted, those who wield power in such a world can shape reality to their advantage, often without moral restraint. The modern world is caught in a paradox. We have rejected the divine order, yet we continue to seek meaning and structure. This tension between freedom and responsibility, between individual autonomy and collective ideology, is at the heart of Nietzsche's legacy. His ideas force us to confront uncomfortable truths about the consequences of living without a transcendent moral framework, yet they also offer us a path forward, one where we can create meaning for ourselves, but only by embracing the chaos, the uncertainty, and the struggle that life demands. Nietzsche's legacy is not one of despair, but of challenge. He dared us to live authentically in a world where the sacred has fallen. In doing so, he left us a blueprint for navigating the modern world, not by clinging to empty ideologies or false certainties, but by embracing the terrifying freedom that comes with confronting the abyss. Only then can we truly create our own values, and in doing so, redefine what it means to live a meaningful life in the 21st century. As we stand in the aftermath of Nietzsche's proclamation that God is dead, we are confronted with the deepest questions about human existence. What remains when the structures of divine meaning and authority fall away? How do we navigate a world that, for many, has lost its transcendent purpose? Through this exploration, we've examined the psychological, philosophical, and societal consequences of a post-religious world. Nietzsche's vision of a universe devoid of divine guidance has given rise to existential angst, ideological extremism, and a profound search for meaning in a secular age. We have seen how the absence of religious authority has led to a vacuum that has been filled with ideologies, social movements, and media narratives, each claiming to provide truth, direction, and purpose. Yet, these substitutes often come with their own dangers, from political polarization to the manipulation of public perception. So, what is the answer? How can we find meaning in a world where the sacred no longer offers clear answers? Nietzsche's challenge to humanity was not to succumb to nihilism, but to embrace the freedom that comes with creating our own values in the absence of an external moral compass. The responsibility to shape meaning lies with the individual. This is the essence of self-overcoming, a central tenet of Nietzsche's philosophy. To live authentically in a post-religious world, we must confront the chaos and uncertainty of existence, embracing the struggle that it entails. This means finding our own path, defining our own values, and living with a sense of purpose that comes not from external doctrines, but from our deepest desires, convictions, and choices. In this modern, secular world, meaning is not handed to us. It is not something we find in doctrines or ideologies. It is something we create with courage and conviction, whether through art, relationships, work, or the pursuit of knowledge. We must actively engage with life, forging meaning in a world that often feels indifferent. As Nietzsche suggests, it is through embracing life's challenges that we find true freedom to live, to think, and to act in ways that reflect our deepest understanding of who we are. In the end, meaning in a post-religious world isn't found in escaping the void, but in confronting it head-on and choosing to create something beautiful from its infinite possibilities.